In the early 1960s, Rogers drums set the standard for American percussion. Hardware so precisely machined that competitors' own endorsees stripped their kits to install it. A snare drum that solved an engineering problem the rest of the industry hadn't tried to solve, every instrument tuned by one man's ears before it left a small factory in Covington, Ohio. Then the decisions began. A sale to CBS in 1966. A move from Covington to California by 1969. The three men who'd built the brand replaced by an org chart. The man who tuned the snare drums left behind in Ohio, while the name went west without him. By 1983, the brand was discontinued. 134 years of continuous existence ended. The building in Covington still stands, unmarked, quiet, carrying no visible sign of what happened inside it. This is the story of how a former farmer with 43 patents, a village too small to absorb mediocrity, and a decade of obsessive precision built something that the biggest names in music trusted with their careers, and how it was taken apart, not by a single disaster, but by a long chain of choices, each one reasonable, none of them reversible. The story begins not with a drum, but with a skin. In 1849, in the years before the Civil War had given America any reason to need more drums than it already had, a man named Joseph Rogers started a company that stretched calf skin over wooden hoops. He wasn't building instruments, he was building drum heads, the membrane that takes the strike, the surface that turns a hollow shell into a voice. His was the first company in America to do it commercially, and for decades, that was enough. The Rogers name lived quietly through the second half of the 19th century. It survived the Civil War, survived the turn of the century, survived the shift from military drumming to vaudeville stages and dance halls, from marching cadences to the pulse of early jazz. The company adapted because it had to. Calfskin was calfskin, but the hands hitting it kept changing, and what they wanted from a drumhead kept changing with them. The public record disagrees in places about exactly who held the company first. Some histories name the founding figure as James Rogers, an immigrant, with Joseph as the next generation. Others put Joseph at the beginning. The safe truth is this: a Rogers family established the business in 1849, and that business survived long enough to outlive the men who started it. That alone sets it apart from most American enterprises of the era. By the 1930s, the business had passed to a grandson, Cleveland Rogers. And Cleveland did something the family hadn't done in nearly a century. He started making drums, not just heads, whole drums. Shells, hardware, tension rods, lugs, the full architecture of a working instrument. It was a pivot that might have seemed reckless from the outside. The Rogers family had spent 80 years perfecting one component. Now the grandson was betting the name on an entirely different product. But Cleveland understood something that the ledger books couldn't show him. The drumhead business had a ceiling, and the ceiling was getting lower. Synthetic heads were coming. The calfskin trade that had sustained 3 generations of Rogers men wouldn't sustain a fourth, so he built drums. And for a while he built them well enough to keep the company alive. But alive isn't the same thing as thriving, and Cleveland Rogers, for all his instincts, didn't have the resources or the reach to turn a regional drum operation into something that could compete on a national stage. The company needed capital. It needed engineering talent. It needed someone who could see what the brand might become if it had the right people behind it. That someone arrived in the mid-1950s. His name was Henry Grossman. Grossman didn't come from drums. He came from business. The kind of post-war American business mind that looked at a product, saw its potential, and understood that potential was a function of people, not just materials. When he purchased the Rogers Company, the public record varies on whether it was 1953 or 1955, but the effect is the same either way. The company that had been a family operation for over a century changed hands, and everything that followed, every innovation, every patent, every legendary instrument, traces back to what Grossman did next. He moved the operation to Covington, Ohio. Covington was small, a village really in the farm country of Miami County, about 30 miles north of Dayton. It wasn't a place anyone would have chosen for a drum factory if they were thinking about logistics or shipping lanes or proximity to the music business. Grossman chose it because the space was right, The cost was right, and because he believed that the kind of work he wanted done, precise, unhurried, built by hand and checked by eye, didn't need a big city. It needed a quiet one. That choice would define everything. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. What Grossman built in Covington wasn't just a factory, it was a system, a three-man engine that would, within a decade, produce some of the most respected percussion instruments in America. And the engine ran on a division of labor so clean it could have been drawn on a napkin. Grossman handled vision and business. A local inventor named Joe Thompson handled engineering. A music industry veteran named Ben Strauss handled artist relations. Three men, three roles, no overlap, no confusion, no committee. Henry Grossman was the architect. He'd seen what Rogers could be, not a scrappy regional brand selling to school bands, but a professional-grade manufacturer whose name would appear on stages alongside the biggest acts in the country. That was the ambition, and in the mid-1950s, it was an ambitious ambition. The American drum market had its established powers. Ludwig was in Chicago. Slingerland was in Niles, Illinois. Gretsch had been making drums in Brooklyn since before the First World War. Rogers, by comparison, was the newcomer with the old name. A century of history, and almost none of it in the instrument business as the post-war generation understood it. But Grossman had Joe Thompson. Thompson is the character the story turns on. Not because he was famous, he never was, not in the way a rock drummer or a company president becomes famous, but because he was the reason Rogers drums became Rogers drums. He was a former farmer, a musician, a man who'd opened the Thompson Etter music store in Covington back in 1939 and had been tinkering with musical instruments ever since. By the time Grossman brought him into the Rogers operation, Thompson held patents. Not a few. 43 of them, many music-related, accumulated over a lifetime of solving problems that nobody else had bothered to define as problems in the first place. His most unlikely invention had nothing to do with drums at all. Thompson had created the flutophone, a simple, inexpensive wind instrument designed for school music programs. It was the kind of product that doesn't win industry awards or appear in magazine advertisements, but it put music into the hands of children who might never have touched an instrument otherwise. Millions of American kids learned basic melody on a flutophone without ever knowing that the man who invented it was, at the same time, reinventing drum hardware in a small Ohio factory. That's the paradox of Joe Thompson. He could think at the scale of a child's first melody and at the scale of a professional drummer's most demanding technical requirements. And he didn't seem to see a contradiction between the two. A problem was a problem. You studied it, you prototyped a solution, you tested it until it worked. Whether the problem was teaching a 7-year-old to play Mary Had a Little Lamb or eliminating the mechanical choke on a snare drum's resonant head, the method was the same. Ben Strauss completed the trio. If Grossman was the strategist and Thompson was the inventor, Strauss was the man who put Rogers drums in front of the people who mattered, the working professionals whose endorsements could make or break a brand. Artist relations in the drum business wasn't just about writing checks and shipping free equipment, it was about trust. A professional drummer's kit was a tool of survival. It had to work every night under stage lights, under the pressure of a live audience. If you put your name on a brand, you were staking your livelihood on it. Strauss understood this. He built relationships the way Thompson built hardware, with patience, specificity, and an attention to what the player actually needed rather than what the catalog said they should want. Together, the three of them turned Covington into something improbable, a village of a few thousand people surrounded by cornfields, producing percussion instruments that would end up on the biggest stages in the world. It didn't happen overnight. It happened through years of incremental improvement. A better tom mount here, a more reliable bass drum pedal there, each small advance building on the one before it, each one carrying Thompson's signature obsession with solving the problem rather than merely manufacturing around it. The factory itself was modest. No gleaming corporate campus, no architect-designed atrium, just a functional building in a small town filled with machinists and assemblers who lived within a few miles of where they worked. Many of them had grown up in Covington or the surrounding farms. They weren't recruited from engineering schools or lured with relocation packages. They were local people trained to do precision work, and they took to it the way their neighbors took to planting and harvest, with the steady, unshowy competence of people who understood that quality was a daily practice, not a slogan on a wall. Covington itself shaped the culture of the factory in ways that a larger city never could have. In a town that small, there was no anonymity. The man who machined your tom mount might sit next to you at church on Sunday. The woman who inspected your hardware finish might be your daughter's schoolteacher's wife. The quality of the work wasn't enforced by supervisors walking the floor with clipboards. It was enforced by proximity, by the simple, unspoken fact that in a place where everyone knew everyone, your name was on the work, even when your name wasn't literally on the work. Grossman had understood this when he chose the location. A big city factory could absorb mediocrity, a Covington factory couldn't. And that constraint, which might have looked like a limitation on paper, was actually the company's greatest asset. The smallness of the town became the tightness of the product. By the late 1950s, the Covington plant was producing drums and hardware that the industry couldn't ignore. The brand's reputation was rising, not on the strength of marketing budgets or celebrity flash, but on the quieter authority of a product that worked the way it was supposed to. Drummers talked. They compared notes in rehearsal rooms and backstage hallways. They noticed when a tom mount didn't slip, when a hi-hat clutch held firm through a 4-hour set, when a snare drum responded to dynamics with a clarity that cheaper instruments simply couldn't match. And they asked each other the same question: what are you playing? The answer, more and more often, was Rogers. The company was becoming something, and the thing it was becoming had everything to do with Covington. The product that changed everything was a piece of hardware so elegant that drummers from competing brands would strip their own kits to install it. They called it the Swiv-O-Matic. To a non-drummer, hardware sounds like an afterthought: the stands, the mounts, the brackets that hold the actual drums in place. But any working percussionist will tell you that hardware is where a kit lives or dies. A drum can have the most beautiful shell in the world, the finest bearing edges, heads tuned to perfection, and if the mount slips during the second song, if the cymbal stand creeps across the stage floor, if the tom arm won't hold its angle under the force of repeated strikes, none of that beauty matters. The drummer spends the night fighting the equipment instead of playing music. Thompson understood this because he was a musician himself. He'd sat behind a kit. He knew what it felt like when a mount drifted, when a stand wobbled, when the small mechanical failures accumulated into a large professional problem. And he approached that problem the way he approached every problem. Not by accepting the existing design and making it slightly better, but by rethinking the mechanics from the ground up. The Swiv-O-Matic system was the result. It used a ball and socket joint that let drummers position their toms and cymbal arms at virtually any angle, then lock them there with a confidence that bordered on permanence. The hardware didn't creep, it didn't slip, it didn't require the constant mid-set adjustments that drummers on other brands had resigned themselves to as the cost of doing business. You set it, you locked it, you played, and when the gig was over, the hardware was still exactly where you'd put it. What made the Swiv-O-Matic remarkable wasn't just the design. It was the machining. Each component was manufactured to tolerances that the rest of the drum industry considered unnecessary for hardware. The threads were precise. The chrome was heavy. The castings were clean, free of the bubbles and rough edges that cheaper hardware carried as a matter of course. Picking up a piece of Swiv-O-Matic hardware and comparing it to a competitor's equivalent was like picking up a surgical instrument next to a kitchen utensil. The difference wasn't subtle, and it was immediately apparent in the hand. The effect on the professional market was immediate. Drummers didn't just prefer Rogers hardware, they coveted it. Players endorsing Ludwig or Slingerland or Gretsch would quietly swap out their stock hardware for Swiv-O-Matic components, because the engineering advantage was too significant to ignore out of brand loyalty. Ringo Starr did it. Mitch Mitchell, who played alongside Jimi Hendrix, did it. When even your competitors' artists are installing your parts on their kits, you've stopped making a product and started setting a standard. But Thompson wasn't finished. The hardware had established Rogers as a serious engineering brand. What came next would establish it as a legendary one. In 1962, Rogers introduced the Dyna-Sonic snare drum. The snare is the heartbeat of a drum kit, the crack that cuts through every mix, the voice that defines a drummer's sound more than any other single instrument in the setup. And the snare drum, for all its apparent simplicity, carried an engineering problem that the industry had never fully solved. The snare wires, the coiled metal strands stretched across the bottom head that give the drum its distinctive buzz and snap, pressed against the resonant head in a way that choked the drum's sustain and limited its dynamic range. Hit it softly and the response was muffled. Hit it hard and the wires rattled against the head in ways that blurred the articulation. Every snare drum on the market was, to some degree, fighting itself. Thompson's solution was to float the snare wires on a rail system that held them in contact with the resonant head, but freed them from the compression that caused the choke. The wires could vibrate sympathetically without being crushed against the head. The result was a snare drum that breathed. It responded to soft touches with a clarity that felt almost pianistic, and it answered hard strokes with a crack that carried without distortion. The Dyna-Sonic didn't just sound different. It felt different under the hands, more alive, more responsive, more willing to translate the full range of a drummer's intentions into sound. Rogers didn't present the Dyna-Sonic as a luxury. They presented it as a solution. The marketing was technical, almost clinical. Here's the problem, here's how we solved it, here is what it means for your playing. That approach fit the company's identity perfectly. Rogers wasn't selling glamour or tradition or rock and roll mystique. Rogers was selling engineering, and the Dyna-Sonic was the proof. The timing mattered too. By 1962, American popular music was entering the most explosive period of growth it had ever seen. Rock and roll had already transformed the culture once, and the British invasion was about to transform it again. Drummers were playing louder, faster, and in front of larger audiences than any previous generation of percussionists had imagined. They needed equipment that could keep up. They needed hardware that wouldn't fail under the physical demands of a 2-hour rock set. They needed a snare drum that could whisper in a jazz ballad and crack through a wall of amplified guitars. Rogers had all of it. The Swiv-O-Matic for reliability, the Dyna-Sonic for sound, and underneath both, the culture of a small Ohio factory where every instrument was checked, tuned, and finished by people who understood that the drummer at the end of the line was trusting them with a livelihood. The competitors were watching, and some of them were worried. Ludwig, the long-standing heavyweight, still had the brand recognition. Ringo had played Ludwig on Ed Sullivan, and that image had moved more drums than any advertisement in the history of the industry. Slingerland had tradition. Gretsch had jazz credentials and a New York pedigree, but none of them had Thompson's engineering, and none of them had hardware that could match the Swiv-O-Matic's precision. Rogers was winning the argument that mattered most in the professional market, the argument about function. Not which drum looked best in the catalog, which drum worked best on the gig. The brand's reputation didn't just grow. It crossed genres. Jazz players respected it for the Dyna-Sonic sensitivity. Rock drummers relied on it for the hardware's indestructibility. Session musicians, the anonymous professionals who played on records that sold millions, trusted it because it worked every time, without complaint, without adjustment, without fail. Mitch Mitchell, who played alongside Jimi Hendrix, stripped his own kit to install Rogers' hardware. The endorsement wasn't on paper. It was in the parts bolted to his drums, visible to anyone who looked closely enough. By the mid-1960s, Rogers occupied a position in the drum world that very few brands in any industry ever achieve. They weren't just competing. They were the standard against which competition was measured, and the standard had been set in Covington, Ohio, a village surrounded by farmland where a former farmer with 43 patents had solved problems that the biggest names in the business hadn't even tried to solve. The Covington factory wasn't large. It didn't need to be. What it needed to be was precise. And precision at Rogers was not a policy posted on a corkboard. It was a practice, daily, personal, embedded in the hands of the people who did the work. A drum shell arrived at the finishing department as bare wood, maple typically, shaped and glued, the burying edges already cut to the tolerances that would determine how the head sat and how the drum resonated. The shell had to be round, not approximately round, not close enough, but geometrically true. Even a slight deviation would compromise the seal between head and edge, and a compromised seal meant a compromised sound. The people who checked those shells didn't use sophisticated electronic instruments. They used their hands and their eyes, the same way a carpenter uses a level, quickly, confidently, and with the unspoken understanding that if they let a bad shell through, someone downstream would know. Painting was its own discipline. Marvin Thompson, no relation to Joe, was the factory's painter, and his work went beyond cosmetics. The finish on a drum shell isn't just decoration. It's part of the instrument's acoustic envelope. Too thick and it dampens resonance. Uneven and it creates dead spots. Marvin applied each coat with the patient consistency of someone who understood that what looked like a surface treatment was actually a sonic decision. He knew which finishes the professionals preferred, knew that the marine pearl wrap had to be laid without bubbles, that the lacquer on a natural finish shell had to be thin enough to let the wood breathe. Years after the factory's golden era, he'd still walk visitors through the building, pointing out where the paint room had been, explaining the process in the kind of detail that only a man who'd done the work 10,000 times could summon. The hardware department ran on its own rhythm. Lathes cut the raw stock for Swiv-O-Matic components, each piece machined to the specifications Thompson had laid down. The chrome plating came back bright and heavy. Rogers' chrome had a weight you could feel in the hand, a density that told you before you ever mounted it that this was hardware built to endure. Assembly workers fitted the parts together with the quiet focus of people who understood tolerances. A sloppy thread, a casting with a void, a plating job with a blister. These weren't abstractions in Covington. They were the kinds of failures that would show up in a drummer's hands 1,000 miles away, and the people on the line knew it. But the real soul of the Covington factory's quality lived in one man and one job. Jerry Shields tuned the Dyna-Sonic snare drums. Not a team, not a department. One man. Joe Thompson had trained him personally, and from 1960 through the end of the Covington era, Shields was the only person who performed the final tuning and quality inspection on every Dyna-Sonic that left the plant. Every snare that a professional drummer unboxed, every Dyna-Sonic that ended up on a stage or in a studio, had been heard and approved by Jerry Shields before it went into its case. That fact alone tells you something about the scale of the operation and about its values. A larger company would have trained a dozen tuners. A corporation would have developed a standardized testing protocol and assigned it to whoever was available on the shift. Rogers gave the job to one man because the job required one man's ears, one man's judgment, one man's accumulated understanding of what a Dyna-Sonic was supposed to sound like when everything was right. Shields didn't check drums against a spec sheet. He checked them against an internal standard that he developed through years of listening, tapping, adjusting, and listening again. The smell of the plant was lacquer and wood shavings and machine oil, not the heavy industrial stench of a foundry or a chemical works, but something lighter, more particular, the smell of a place where small tolerances mattered more than volume. The sound was tapping, constant arrhythmic tapping, hands testing heads, sticks checking response, the irregular percussion of instruments being tuned before they ever reached a drummer. Underneath it, the hum of lathes turning hardware components, the whir of buffing wheels polishing chrome, the occasional sharp report of a pneumatic tool setting a lug. Workers arrived in the morning from homes within a few miles of the factory. Many of them drove past the fields they'd grown up on, past churches their families had attended for generations, past the same downtown blocks they'd known since childhood. The commute, if you could call it that, rarely exceeded 10 minutes. There was no separation between the life of the worker and the life of the town. The same people who assembled drums on Tuesday coached Little League on Saturday. The same hands that set bearing edges carved turkey at Thanksgiving tables, 3 blocks from the plant. The work was skilled, but it didn't announce itself as skilled. Nobody at the Covington factory called themselves an artisan or a craftsman. Those words belong to a later vocabulary, one that emerged after the work was gone and people needed language to describe what had been lost. In Covington, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, it was just work. Good work, steady work. Work that required attention and rewarded it. Work that turned raw materials into instruments that some of the best musicians in the world would trust with their careers. And at the end of the line, after the shells were finished and the hardware mounted and the heads tensioned and the whole instrument checked one final time, each drum was packed into a case and placed on a shipping pallet. Those pallets left Covington on trucks that pulled out past the same cornfields the workers drove past every morning. The drums would end up in music shops in Manhattan, in warehouse distributors in Los Angeles, in backline rental companies that supplied the biggest tours in the country. But they all started here. Every last one of them started in a factory in a village where the loudest sound at night was crickets. What the plant made mattered beyond the factory walls. Rogers drums didn't stay in Covington. They traveled to recording studios in New York and Los Angeles, to concert stages in Chicago and London, to jazz clubs where the drummer's touch was the quietest and most critical sound in the room. And everywhere they went, they carried the imprint of the place that made them. The tight tolerances, the hand-checked finishes, the hardware that didn't slip, the snare that breathed. Ben Strauss had done his work well. By the early 1960s, Rogers' endorsements stretched across genres in a way that few drum brands could match. The company's artist roster wasn't confined to one corner of American music. It reached from the precision of studio session work to the raw energy of rock and roll, from the sophistication of big band jazz to the experimental edges of the counterculture. Rogers wasn't a niche brand. It was a professional brand, and that distinction mattered. It meant the drums were chosen by players whose livelihoods depended on reliability, not by hobbyists shopping on price. The Covington years, from the time Grossman moved the operation to Ohio through the mid-1960s, became the company's acknowledged golden age, not just in retrospect, but in the company's own telling of its story. Rogers' official history still treats this period as the definitive high point, the era when everything the brand represented came into alignment. The engineering, the quality control, the artist relationships, the reputation. It was the decade when Rogers moved from respected competitor to top-tier professional brand, and Covington itself absorbed the identity. The village wasn't large enough to be shaped by many forces at once. When a factory of that caliber operates in a town of a few thousand people, it doesn't just employ residents, it becomes part of the civic tissue, the thing the town is known for, the source of a pride that extends beyond the payroll. People in Covington knew what Rogers' drums were. They knew the names of the players who used them. They understood, in the quiet way that small-town Americans understand the enterprises that sustain their communities, that something of consequence was being built in their midst. The pride ran deeper than economics. It was the pride of precision, of knowing that your town, a dot on the Ohio map that most Americans couldn't find if you gave them the county, was producing instruments played by musicians whose records you heard on the radio. The factory wasn't making parts for some other company's product. It was making the product itself, start to finish, and putting the name Rogers on it before it shipped. That directness mattered. The workers in Covington could trace a straight line from their labor to the sound a drummer made on a stage in New York or Los Angeles. There were no intermediaries, no anonymous supply chains, no corporate layers between the work and its purpose. The social world of the factory extended into the town's daily life. Workers ate at the same handful of restaurants. They shopped at the same stores on Broadway Street. Their children attended Covington schools, played on Covington ball fields, grew up within walking distance of the building where their parents spent their days. The factory and the town existed in the kind of symbiosis that larger cities never experience, a mutual dependence so complete that it was invisible from the inside. Nobody in Covington in 1963 would have described their relationship with the Rogers plant as symbiotic. They would have simply described it as life. The dominance was real, but it was a particular kind of dominance, earned by engineering and word of mouth rather than by marketing blitzes or corporate scale. Rogers didn't outspend Ludwig or Slingerland. It outperformed them in the hands of the players who could tell the difference. That's a harder kind of reputation to build, and a more fragile one. It depends on sustaining the conditions that created it, the specific people, the specific culture, the specific relationship between the maker and the instrument. Remove any one element and the reputation doesn't collapse immediately. It just stops being replenished. And reputations that aren't replenished eventually become memories. The brand's aura had crossed from jazz into rock without losing credibility in either. That's rare in any instrument category. Most brands are claimed by one genre and viewed with suspicion by the others. Rogers escaped that trap because its appeal was functional, not tribal. The drums didn't sound like jazz drums or rock drums. They sounded like drums that responded honestly to whatever the player asked of them. That neutrality, if you could call it that, was of all was itself a kind of engineering achievement. Thompson hadn't built instruments with a predetermined voice. He'd built instruments that amplified the voice of whoever sat behind them. For now, the reputation was alive. Covington was the center of gravity, and the center held. Grossman ran the business. Thompson filed patents. Strauss kept the artists loyal. Shields tuned the Dyna-Sonics. Marvin Thompson painted the shells. The system worked because every part of it was connected to every other part, and all of it was connected to one small town in western Ohio, where the work got done the way it was supposed to get done. That was 1965, the highest point. In 1965, Rogers drums had never been more respected. The Dyna-Sonic was 3 years into production and had already reshaped professional expectations of what a snare drum could do. The Swiv-O-Matic hardware system was so widely imitated and so rarely equaled that it had become the de facto standard by which all drum hardware was judged. The Covington factory hummed with the steady productivity of a plant that had found its rhythm and its purpose. Henry Grossman had built exactly what he'd set out to build: a premium percussion brand, an engineering-first culture, a factory where quality wasn't a marketing claim, but a material fact, verified by hand, one instrument at a time. The company's position in the market was secure, its reputation at its peak, its product line the envy of an industry. And CBS was watching. The Columbia Broadcasting System had been building a musical instruments division throughout the early and mid-1960s. The logic was the logic of the era: conglomerate diversification. The conviction that a well-managed corporation could apply its capital and its organizational discipline to any product category and extract value. CBS had already acquired Fender guitars in 1965 for $13 million, absorbing the most iconic electric guitar brand in the world into the same corporate structure that produced television news and Broadway cast albums. Musical instruments were hot. The baby boom generation was buying guitars and drums at a rate the industry had never seen. The executives in the CBS tower on 6th Avenue saw the numbers and saw opportunity. In 1966, Grossman sold Rogers to CBS. The terms of the deal don't occupy much space in the public record. What occupies space is what happened next. By August of that year, months, not years, after the acquisition, CBS Musical Instruments had already installed its own management structure. Richard Stephen was appointed vice president of Rogers, reporting to Donald Randall, the general manager of CBS Musical Instruments. These were corporate appointments, not factory appointments. Stephen and Randall weren't hardware engineers or drum builders. They were managers in a division of a broadcasting company, and their job was to manage a portfolio that now included Fender guitars, Rogers drums, and a growing list of other instrument brands. The org chart arrived before the dust had settled on the sale. In Covington, the work continued. The Dyna-Sonic still rolled off the line. Jerry Shields still tuned them. Marvin Thompson still painted. The factory floor still smelled of lacquer and wood and machine oil. But the chain of command had changed. The decisions about what to build, how to build it, where to build it, those decisions no longer belonged to the three men who had created the brand's reputation. They belonged to a corporation headquartered a continent away, a corporation whose primary business was putting images on television screens, not drums on stages. Nobody inside the Covington factory could have known, in the summer of 1966, what the next 3 years would bring. The plant was still running. The brand was still dominant. The instruments were still the same instruments they'd been the year before. But the system that had produced those instruments, the Grossman-Thompson-Strauss engine, the compact ecology of vision and invention and trust, had been absorbed into something larger. And larger, in this case, didn't mean stronger. It meant more distant, more layered, more susceptible to priorities that had nothing to do with the sound a snare drum made when Jerry Shields tapped it with his fingertips and listened. That was the summit. The people inside those walls just didn't know it yet. The first thing CBS changed wasn't the product. It was the paperwork. In Covington, under Grossman, decisions had traveled short distances. An idea moved from Thompson's workbench to Grossman's desk to Strauss's phone calls in a matter of days, sometimes hours. If Thompson wanted to prototype a new mount design, he prototyped it. If Grossman wanted to approve a new finish for the catalog, He walked to the paint room and talked to Marvin Thompson. If Strauss heard from a touring drummer that a particular hi-hat clutch was failing under heavy use, that information reached the engineering bench before the drummer's next gig. The system was fast because it was small, and it was effective because every person in it understood what the company was trying to be. CBS didn't destroy that system on purpose. It replaced it with its own, the standard corporate apparatus of divisions, reporting lines, budget approvals, and quarterly reviews. Richard Stephen, the new vice president of Rogers, reported to Donald Randall at CBS Musical Instruments. Randall reported up the CBS chain. Decisions that had once been made by 3 men in Ohio now passed through layers of management in New York and California, each layer adding time, each layer adding distance between the people who understood drums and the people who approved expenditures. This is the seed that's hardest to photograph and easiest to feel. Nothing broke, nothing was canceled, no one was fired in those first months. But the ecology had changed. The Grossman-Thompson-Strauss engine had run on proximity and trust, the informal, almost familial understanding that came from working together in a small town on a shared project for years. CBS offered something different: resources, distribution, capital. What it couldn't offer was the thing it had just purchased, the culture that made the product worth buying in the first place. The second seed was geographic, and it was slower but more visible. CBS owned Fender. Fender operated out of Fullerton, California. CBS Musical Instruments was building a consolidated operation where its instrument brands could share facilities, share logistics, share overhead. The logic was the logic of every conglomerate consolidation in post-war American business. Why run two plants when one will do? Why maintain a small factory in rural Ohio when you have a larger complex on the West Coast already tooled for manufacturing? The question answered itself, at least on the spreadsheet. Fullerton had the space. Fullerton had the infrastructure. Fullerton was where CBS was already investing. Covington, by comparison, was a village of a few thousand people in western Ohio, accessible by two-lane roads, far from any major market, offering nothing that Fullerton couldn't replicate. On paper. On paper. That qualifier is where the tragedy lives. Because what Covington offered wasn't on any paper CBS executives were reading. It was in the hands of the machinists who'd been trained by Joe Thompson. It was in the ears of Jerry Shields, who could hear the difference between a Dyna-Sonic that was right and one that was close. It was in the muscle memory of the assembly workers who'd spent years learning the specific tolerances that made Rogers hardware feel like Rogers hardware. None of that transferred in a moving truck. The third seed was the most abstract and the most corrosive. Rogers, under Grossman, had been the center of its own universe. Every decision the company made was a Rogers decision, aimed at Rogers quality, evaluated by Rogers standards. Under CBS, Rogers became one-line item in a portfolio that included Fender guitars, Rhodes keyboards, Steinway pianos, and a growing roster of other brands. The attention of management was divided. The priorities were corporate priorities: margin, volume, market share across the portfolio, not the obsessive, single-brand focus that had built the Covington reputation. And outside the CBS portfolio, the competitive landscape was shifting in ways that made Rogers' premium position harder to defend. The Japanese manufacturers were coming. Pearl, Tama, Yamaha, companies backed by industrial engineering traditions and labor costs that American drum makers couldn't match. Their early instruments were easy to dismiss. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, they weren't. The quality was rising, the prices were lower, and the generation of drummers entering the market didn't carry the same automatic reverence for American-made instruments that their predecessors had. They bought what sounded good and cost less. Loyalty to a brand name, even a name as strong as Rogers, was not inherited. It had to be earned fresh with every catalog cycle, every product launch, every encounter between a drummer and a new instrument in a music shop. Rogers' advantage had always been specific: premium engineering, meticulous quality control, the Dyna-Sonic's responsiveness, the Swiv-O-Matic's precision. That kind of edge requires constant reinvestment, not just in new products, but in the culture of attention that produces them. Under Grossman, the reinvestment was automatic. It was what the company did. Under CBS, reinvestment competed with other demands on the same corporate budget. A dollar spent on Rogers engineering was a dollar not spent on Fender marketing or roads development. The math was corporate math, and corporate math doesn't have a line item for institutional obsession. There was another vulnerability, one that nobody at CBS would have identified as a problem because it looked like an asset. Rogers' reputation rested on a remarkably small number of people. Thompson held the patents, Shields held the quality standard, Strauss held the artist relationships, Grossman held the vision. In a company of thousands, losing any one of those people would have been manageable. In a company this small, each of them was irreplaceable, not because they were brilliant in the abstract, but because their skills had developed in response to this specific company, this specific factory, this specific set of relationships. They were tuned to Rogers the way Shields tuned a Dyna-Sonic, precisely over years by ear. And like any precisely tuned instrument, the system was vulnerable to any force that changed the tension. CBS was that force, not through malice. Through structure. None of these seeds looked fatal in 1966 or 1967. The drums coming off the Covington line were still Covington drums, still built by Covington hands, still tuned by Jerry Shields. A drummer who bought a Rogers kit in 1967 wouldn't have noticed the CBS logo on the corporate letterhead. The product hadn't changed, but the conditions that sustained the product were changing quietly, in ways that would only become visible when it was too late to reverse them. The company was still making great drums, it just wasn't the same company anymore. Henry Grossman had sold Rogers to CBS for reasons that made sense in 1966. National distribution, deeper capital, a place inside the largest musical instruments organization in the country. Grossman wasn't a fool, and he wasn't a traitor. He was a businessman who'd built something remarkable in a small town, and who believed, or hoped, that a larger owner could take it further than he could alone. That belief was shared by thousands of American business owners in the 1960s who sold their companies to conglomerates. Most of them believed the same thing. Most of them were wrong in the same way. Consider what the mid-1960s looked like from Grossman's position. The music business was exploding. The Beatles had landed. Every teenager in America wanted a guitar, and a fair number of them wanted drums. The demand for instruments was outstripping the capacity of small manufacturers to supply it. Grossman could see the wave. He could also see the limits of a small factory in a small town. Rogers couldn't scale the way the market was demanding. Without capital he didn't have. CBS had that capital. CBS had distribution networks that reached every music shop in the country. CBS had in Fender a proven model for bringing an iconic instrument brand into a corporate structure and, at least in the early years, maintaining its identity while expanding its reach. The decision to sell was the first fatal choice, and it belonged to Grossman, not because he acted in bad faith, but because the sale set in motion a chain of consequences that no subsequent decision could undo. Once Rogers was a CBS asset, its fate was tied to CBS's priorities. And CBS's priorities, it would become clear, did not include maintaining a small factory in a small Ohio town when a larger facility was available elsewhere. The irony is that what made Rogers valuable to CBS was exactly the thing CBS was structurally incapable of preserving. CBS bought Rogers because of its reputation, the engineering prestige, the professional trust, the Dyna-Sonic's authority. But that reputation was inseparable from the conditions that created it. The three-man engine, the Covington workforce, the culture of obsessive precision in a village where shortcuts would have been noticed by the person at the next workbench. CBS couldn't bottle that culture and ship it to a boardroom. It could only own the name and hope the culture came with it. The second decision was the move. By 1969, 3 years after the acquisition, Rogers' production had shifted from Covington to Fullerton, California. The drums would now be made alongside Fender guitars in the CBS Musical Instruments Complex, a facility designed for the kind of volume manufacturing that CBS understood and that Covington had never been built for. 3 years. That's how long it took for the geographic center of American drum excellence to move from a village in western Ohio to a suburb in Orange County. 3 years from the sale to the silencing of the Covington plant. In corporate terms, that's a brisk transition. In human terms, it was a slow motion upheaval that gave every worker in the factory time to understand what was coming without the power to stop it. The human math of that decision is where the story turns from corporate history into something heavier. The workers in Covington faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Move to California. Leave your house, your family's history in Miami County, the town where your kids went to school and your parents went to church. Or stay in Covington and find other work. For most of them, moving wasn't realistic. These were people whose lives were rooted in Western Ohio the way their grandparents' lives had been rooted there. California wasn't just far away. It was a different America. Different costs, different culture, different rhythms. The cost of living alone would have consumed whatever wage CBS was offering, and the jobs waiting in Fullerton weren't the same jobs they'd held in Covington. They were positions in a larger operation, not roles in a three-man ecosystem where everyone knew everyone and every drum was personal. Bill Davids and Dan Davis were among the Covington workers who faced that reckoning. The public record preserves their names without preserving the full stories behind them. What they decided, whether they stayed or went, what happened to their careers after the factory that had defined their working lives, was emptied of its purpose. But their names appear in the oral history traces of the Covington era, and their presence in the record matters because it keeps the move from being an abstraction. Real people with real names stood in real kitchens and talked about whether to uproot their families for a corporation that had bought their craft. Some workers made the move. The historical record doesn't tell us exactly how many. What it tells us is that the people who defined the Covington era, the machinists trained by Thompson, the assemblers who'd learned the tolerances by feel, the quality control culture that Shields embodied, did not transfer intact. You can move machinery. You can ship inventory. You can relocate a brand name by filing paperwork with the state of California. What you cannot move is the accumulated knowledge of a workforce that learned its craft in a specific place, under specific teachers, inside a specific culture of care. That knowledge isn't stored in manuals or databases. It's stored in hands and ears and habits, and it dies when the community that sustains it is dispersed. Richard Stephen oversaw the transition as Rogers' vice president under the CBS regime. The decisions he and Randall made were the decisions of corporate managers doing what corporate managers do: consolidating, economizing, rationalizing a portfolio. They weren't acting out of malice. They were acting out of the logic that had justified the acquisition in the first place, the conviction that scale and efficiency could improve on what smallness and obsession had built. The logic was coherent. The logic was also wrong. But it was the kind of wrong that only reveals itself years later, when the thing that made the product special has been diluted past the point of recognition, and no one can pinpoint exactly when it happened. The third fatal decision was subtler than a sale or a move, but it mattered just as much. Rogers ceased to be a company and became a brand. The distinction sounds academic until you think about what it meant in practice. A company has a factory, a workforce, a culture, a physical place where decisions are made and products are built. A brand has a name, a logo, a set of associations in the minds of consumers. Under Grossman and Covington, Rogers was a company, a specific group of people doing specific work in a specific building. Under CBS and Fullerton, Rogers became a brand, one of several names in a corporate portfolio, managed by executives whose primary allegiance was to the portfolio, not to any single name within it. The Fullerton drums were still called Rogers. They carried the Rogers name on the badge. The catalog still featured the Dyna-Sonic and the Swiv-O-Matic. But the connection between the name and the culture that had earned the name's reputation was fraying. New designs appeared. The Memorlock mounting system in 1976 showed that innovation hadn't stopped entirely. Rogers engineers, working within the CBS structure, could still solve problems, but each new product arrived in a market where the brand's authority was no longer self-evident. Drummers who'd grown up hearing that Rogers was the standard were now hearing the same claim from Japanese manufacturers whose quality was rising fast and whose prices were significantly lower. The fourth decision was the final one, and it stretched across years. In 1983, CBS sold Rogers along with Fender to a management group. Rogers was soon discontinued. The name didn't die. Names rarely do in the instrument business, because a name with history has value even when the product behind it is gone. But the thing the name had once represented, the Covington factory, the Thompson patents, the Shields-tuned Dyna-Sonics, the Grossman vision, that was finished. What remained was a trademark, available for licensing, available for revival, available for whatever purpose a future owner might find for it. This is the decision that's hardest to assign to a single person, because it was less a decision than a drift. The gradual acceptance, across multiple owners and multiple decades, that the Rogers name had more value as intellectual property than as the identity of an operating factory. Nobody sat in a room and said, let's strip this brand of its manufacturing base and sell it as a label. But that's what happened, one transaction at a time, one ownership change at a time, until the name Rogers referred to a set of legal rights rather than a set of working hands. And future owners did find purposes. The Rogers name passed through hands the way distressed industrial brands often do. Brooke Mays acquired it. Then Yamaha purchased the intellectual property in 2006. A modern revival followed, and the drums bearing the Rogers name today are made with genuine respect for the Covington legacy. But a revival is not a continuation. It's an act of memory applied to manufacturing. The people who build Rogers drums now are not the people who built them in Covington. The factory is not that factory. The town is not involved. Each of these four decisions, the sale, the move, the transformation from company to brand, and the serial transfer of a name stripped from its origin, followed logically from the one before it. That's what makes the story tragic rather than scandalous. A scandal requires villainy. A tragedy requires only a sequence of choices, each one defensible in isolation, whose cumulative effect is the destruction of something that none of the individual choices intended to destroy. The Covington factory didn't close the way a steel mill closes, with a last shift and a padlocked gate and a town left staring at a building that used to mean something. It emptied gradually, and gradual endings are harder to mourn, because there's no single day to mark, no final whistle to remember. The machinery went first, crated and trucked west to Fullerton, where it would be installed in a larger facility and operated by different hands. Then, the specialized tooling. The jigs and fixtures that Joe Thompson had designed for specific operations, the things that only made sense in the context of the Covington workflow, were either shipped or surplused. Then the workers thinned out. Some left for California. Most didn't. Most stayed in Covington or the surrounding towns and found other work. The kind of work that's always available in small-town Ohio if you're willing to adjust your expectations. Other factories, other trades, other ways of earning a paycheck that didn't carry the same weight as the one they'd earned building instruments that ended up on stages they'd never visit. Jerry Shields stayed in Ohio. The man who'd tuned every Dyna-Sonic that left the Covington plant. The man Joe Thompson had personally trained. The man whose ears were the last checkpoint between the factory and the professional world. He didn't follow the brand to California. The brand went west without him. Whatever quality control existed in Fullerton, it existed without the person who had embodied quality control in Covington for nearly a decade. Think about what that means. The single human being most responsible for the sound of the Dyna-Sonic, the instrument that had built the brand's professional reputation, was left behind when the brand moved. Not fired, not pushed out. Simply not part of the plan. The plan was about facilities and logistics and portfolio management. The plan did not have a line item for Jerry Shields' ears. In Fullerton, Rogers drums continued to be manufactured. The name went on the badges. The catalogs went out. The Dyna-Sonic was still listed. The Swiv-O-Matic was still featured. To a casual observer, nothing had changed except the return address. But the drummers knew. The professional community, the session players, the touring musicians, the studio regulars who depended on their instruments the way a surgeon depends on a scalpel. They began to notice differences, not dramatic failures, not instruments that fell apart on stage, something subtler, a slight looseness in the hardware that hadn't been there before, a finish that didn't quite match the Covington standard, a snare drum that was good but not transcendent, competent but not Shields tuned. The notices accumulated quietly. the way they always do in a professional community. Nobody took out an advertisement announcing that Rogers wasn't what it used to be. Nobody organized a boycott. Drummers simply began making different choices. They held on to their Covington-era kits longer. They looked more seriously at the Japanese alternatives. They stopped assuming that the Rogers name on a badge meant the same thing it had meant in 1964. The Fullerton operation tried. The Memrilock mounting system, introduced in 1976, was a genuine engineering achievement, a new approach to tom mounting that showed Rogers could still innovate. But innovation in isolation couldn't restore the cumulative authority of the Covington era. One good idea doesn't rebuild a culture. It proves the talent still exists. It doesn't prove that the system supporting that talent is intact. By the late 1970s, Rogers was competing in a drum market that had fundamentally changed. Pearl and Tama had established themselves as serious professional brands. Yamaha was bringing its industrial engineering prowess to bear on percussion. Ludwig, Rogers' oldest American rival, was also struggling with its own ownership changes and quality control challenges. But Ludwig had decades of deeper brand entrenchment to cushion the fall. Rogers had only the Covington reputation, and the Covington reputation was fading with each year that passed without Covington behind it. The market didn't owe Rogers anything for what it had been. Markets don't remember. They respond to what's in front of them. And what was in front of American drummers in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a widening field of alternatives that offered comparable quality at lower prices, backed by manufacturers whose investment in production infrastructure was accelerating while Rogers was not. The artist roster thinned. The endorsements that Ben Strauss had built, the relationships of trust between the company and the players who staked their careers on its products, were relationships between people, not between a brand name and a market segment. When the people changed, when Strauss was no longer making those calls, when the company behind the name was no longer the company the artists had trusted, the endorsements eroded. A younger generation of drummers came up playing Pearl or Tama and never developed the attachment to the Rogers name that their predecessors had carried. In 1983, CBS made its exit. The corporation that had purchased Rogers 17 years earlier sold it along with Fender to a management-led buyout group. Fender survived the transition and eventually thrived under new ownership. Rogers did not. The brand was discontinued. The name went quiet. No announcement, no farewell catalog, no commemorative final run. For the first time since 1849, there was no Rogers Drum Company operating in any form, in any location, under any ownership. 134 years of continuous existence, interrupted not by war or depression or natural disaster, but by a sequence of corporate transactions that had, step by step, separated the name from the place and the people that gave it meaning. The town adjusted. Small towns always adjust because they have no other option. The loss of a factory in a place like Covington doesn't produce the catastrophic collapse that a mill closure produces in Gary or Youngstown. There was no population crash, no mass exodus, no civic emergency. The wound was quieter than that. It was the loss of a particular kind of purpose, the knowledge that your town made something that mattered to people far away, that the work done on your street had consequences on stages and in studios you'd never see but could imagine. The Rogers name, meanwhile, entered the afterlife that American brand names enter when the thing behind them is gone. It became an asset, a line on a balance sheet, a trademark with residual value, a name that meant something to people who remembered what it used to mean. Brooke Mays, a music retail chain based in Texas, acquired the name. Then Yamaha in 2006 purchased the intellectual property. Then a revival, new drums bearing the old name, new catalogs featuring the Dyna-Sonic and the Swiv-O-Matic, designed with an awareness of what those names meant to the collectors and professionals who remembered the Covington era. Each transfer was a transaction. Each transaction was legal, documented, unremarkable in the context of American brand commerce, and each one moved the Rogers name a little further from the place and the people who had given it meaning. The drums that carried the Rogers badge after Covington were not bad drums. Some of them were good drums. The Fullerton-era instruments had their defenders, and the modern revival has produced instruments that serious players respect. But none of them were Covington drums. None of them had passed through Jerry Shields' hands. None of them carried the particular authority of an instrument built in a village where the whole town knew the factory and the factory knew the whole town. Rogers died as a place before it died as a trademark. That's the sentence the whole story had been building toward, even if nobody inside it could see it at the time. The name survived. The factory didn't. And between those two facts lies the entire distance between a brand and a culture. The building still stands in Covington. It's not a ruin in the dramatic sense, not a shattered cathedral of industry with trees growing through the roof and graffiti on the walls. It's more ordinary than that, and in its ordinariness, more affecting. A functional structure in a small Ohio village, looking much like any other aging commercial building you'd pass on a state route without slowing down. Nothing about its exterior announces what happened inside it. No plaque, no historical marker visible from the road. Just a building that once housed the best drum factory in America, standing quietly, carrying more history in its walls than its current function can account for. The workers who stayed in Covington after the factory emptied went on with their lives the way Americans in small towns have always gone on after the work changes. They adapted. They found jobs at other manufacturers in the surrounding counties, or shifted into trades that didn't carry the same precision or the same pride, but paid the mortgage. Some of them never mentioned the Rogers years unless someone asked. Others couldn't stop talking about them. The way the plant ran, the way the hardware felt when it came off the line right, the particular satisfaction of building something that professional musicians trusted with their careers. The ones who'd been closest to the work carried it longest. Jerry Shields' name became something larger than the man himself. It became a symbol of what Covington-era quality had meant, a shorthand that drum enthusiasts used when they wanted to distinguish between a Rogers drum that was made in Ohio and a Rogers drum that was made anywhere else. Shields tuned entered the vocabulary of collectors the way pre-CBS entered the vocabulary of Fender guitar enthusiasts, a marker of authenticity, a dividing line between the era when the name meant everything and the era when it meant less. In 2024, they came back. Drum enthusiasts, collectors, former employees. They gathered in Covington for the Shields Classic Drum Show and Homecoming Day, an event named for Jerry Shields, the man who'd tuned the Dyna-Sonics, the man whose name had become shorthand for the quality standard that defined the Golden Age. The village of Covington formally recognized the event with a proclamation, which tells you something about what the factory still means to the town. Not just a former employer, a point of identity, the thing that put Covington on a map it would never otherwise have appeared on. Marvin Thompson was there, the factory painter, decades removed from the work, walking attendees through the building, pointing out where the departments had been, the shell room here, the hardware assembly there, the paint station where he'd applied thousands of finishes to thousands of drums. His memory was the map. Without him, the building was just a building. With him, it became a guided tour of a world that existed in the same physical space, but in an entirely different era. He could point to a wall and tell you what had been on the other side of it. He could stand in a doorway and describe what you would have smelled if you'd walked through it in 1962. The people who attended weren't tourists in the conventional sense. They were pilgrims. They'd traveled to a small Ohio town to see the place where the instruments they played or collected or studied had been made. They wanted to stand in the room where Shields had listened. They wanted to touch the walls that had absorbed the smell of lacquer and the sound of constant, careful tapping. What they found was a building that cooperated with their memory just enough to make the absence vivid. The drums were gone. The lathes were gone. The tapping was gone. But the space remained, and space has a way of holding the shape of what once filled it. For the company itself, the aftermath traced the familiar arc of American brand ownership after the factory goes quiet. CBS had held Rogers through the late 1960s and into the era of declining returns. The management sale in 1983 bundled Rogers with Fender and then dropped it. Brooke Mays kept the name alive as a retail play. Yamaha's 2006 acquisition of the intellectual property brought the engineering legacy into the hands of a company large enough and serious enough to honor it. The modern Rogers revival, the drums being made and sold today under the Rogers name, reflects a genuine effort to reconnect with the Covington heritage, to build instruments that echo the standards Grossman and Thompson and Shields established. But a revival operates in the grammar of memory, not continuity. The people making Rogers drums today didn't learn from Joe Thompson. They didn't train under Jerry Shields. They didn't grow up in Covington or drive past the factory on their way to work. They're building instruments informed by a legacy, which is an honorable thing to do. It is not, however, the same thing as being the legacy. The town itself continues. Covington didn't collapse. It's still a village in Miami County, still surrounded by the same fields, still small enough that everyone knows everyone. The factory's absence is not a wound that bleeds. It's more like a phantom limb, the sensation of something that should be there, felt most acutely by the people who remember when it was. The surviving drums are out there, in studios and rehearsal rooms and collectors' basements and climate-controlled storage units, in the hands of players who found them in pawn shops or inherited them from uncles who'd played weekends in cover bands 30 years ago. On auction sites where a Covington-era Dyna-Sonic commands prices that would have astonished the workers who built it. A Covington-era Dyna-Sonic, if you find one and hold it, still carries the evidence of everything this story has been about. The chrome is heavier than it needs to be. The bearing edges are truer than the market required. The snare mechanism, Thompson's floating rail, still solves the problem it was designed to solve, still lets the wires breathe, still gives the drum a voice that later designs have imitated but never quite matched. The hardware outlasts the system that made it. That's the quiet fact at the center of all of this. The Swiv-O-Matic mount that a Covington machinist turned on a lathe in 1963 is still holding a tom in position on someone's kit tonight, still locked at the angle it was set to, still refusing to slip. The man who made it is retired or gone. The factory where he made it serves a different purpose now. The company that employed him has been bought and sold and revived and renamed. But the hardware holds. It was built to hold, and it does. Covington is still there, just past the fields, just off the state route, still small, still quiet in the way that small Ohio towns are quiet. Not empty, just unhurried, just living at the pace that a village surrounded by farmland has always lived at. The building where Rogers' drums were made still stands at its place in the village, solid enough, ordinary enough, carrying no visible sign of what happened inside it, except in the memories of the people who were there, and in the instruments that left through its doors and traveled to every stage in the country. What was lost wasn't a company. Companies come and go, and their names survive them or they don't. What was lost was the alignment. The rare, temporary, unrepeatable alignment of the right people in the right place with the right purpose, producing something that exceeded what any of them could have made alone. Henry Grossman's vision, Joe Thompson's 43 patents, Ben Strauss's relationships, Jerry Shields' ears, Marvin Thompson's steady hand. A village that was small enough to care and skilled enough to deliver. All of it converging in one building, in one town, for one brief decade that the people who lived through it didn't know was brief until it was over. The drums remember. The town remembers. The building stands, and the silence inside it is the silence of a place that was built for sound.